Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today is Sunday, September 7th, 2025. We're going to be looking at the Senate elections in the United States of America with a brand new redone Senate prediction sheet with tons of mini models that are then compiled all together for the low bound, high bound, and the true guess for the result in every single race. Election Time News, your one stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, make sure to follow the Substack threads, Instagram, and X to stay up to date on election news all the time, year round, no matter where it is. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. Now, moving on to the video here, we have the sheet with um, all of the races and with tons of information on all of it. So the reason that I don't have one specific model is because there's sometimes things that models just can't predict right. They can get somewhat close, but if you want to get to the closest, there's some human nuance that just a straight up sheet doing number crunches just can't calculate. So with that, we do have quite a few mini models here with the expected result just based off the partisan lean plus the expected national environment. You have some statistics about the race. You have relative performance, which includes the last race compared to the expected performance in 2020, and then figure out the expected result based on that, as well as the expected result based off of the split tickets wins above replacement rating. We have polls, which there are basically none of quite yet. And then we have the opposition candidate. This is really going to start filling in after the primaries. And then opposition candidate, same thing there. We do have a few presumptive nominees. We're going to be going over a few polls on RCP. There are a few here, mostly just Ohio after Brown entered the race, the Texas Senate, and then also with quite a bit with the Texas Senate, Georgia Senate, North Carolina Senate, and New Hampshire. And we're also going to be looking at the 2026 Senate forecast on race to the White House, which is generally going to be, it's a bit Democratic leaning, but that's still going to be the main thing that we're looking at here, as well as, of course, comparing it to past results and looking at 2020 and how things could go. So, based on all of that, let's just get into the actual map here. What we have is going to be starting off with the um, with the West Coast. Actually, we're going to be going in alphabetical order because that's just the order of the sheet here. So, based on the current true guesses, starting off in Alabama, this is going to be a very safe seat for the Republicans. We don't have incumbency as Tommy Tuberville is retiring. He's going to run for governor after Kay Ivey is done. He is running for governor. There is an open primary here. The only way this could get anything close is if Doug Jones, the former U.S. Senator that actually won a special election here in 2018, if we look at off-cycle elections and split it up, then we can find in 2017, Jones won a very, very close election against a very scandal-plagued opponent by 1.5 points in Alabama. So for a short period of time, there actually was a Democratic senator from Alabama from 2018 all the way through until he lost re-election by 20 and a half in 2020, which is still a very poor performance for a Republican. But the reason that there was an incumbency is why this was 11.3 compared to the expected performance. War rating is -5, which is also going to be because of Jones. But because he hasn't announced that he's going to run yet, then we don't have the incumbency, which is the only reason that it's this close. But the guess is going to be 22.8 points for the Republican. In Alaska, the low bound is -3.2. That's the best that could happen if Mary Peltola does jump into the race here. But as of right now, the true guess is 7.9 points. This is a solid, likely margin. He's not a very strong candidate. He's not poor either, but he's a relatively strong candidate there. So that's mainly going to be the number to watch. So That's going to mainly be the number to watch. Expected result 10. Expected result here minus 1.5 means it would actually be 7.5 point margin. Based on that, he's not an extremely strong candidate. He did win by 12 3/4 in 2020, so that's going to be the main thing there. Can turn that off. That's a bit confusing. That was showing the general election. So that's going to be the main thing in Alaska if Mary Peltola runs or not. If she decides not to, then that would be bad here on Race to the White House. It does show that there's about a 7.7 point margin. It's probably a bit better than that, but he is a bit of an underperformer. There's no polls that we have as of yet. However, in Alaska, Trump's approval rating is struggling somewhat, so that is a potential sign that things could go relatively poorly if Mary Peltola decides to run based off of trying to stop Trump's agenda. It depends entirely on some of the messaging in some of these states, especially with Trump with relatively low approval ratings. So, especially in Ohio, where you have -5, 2024 voters, of course, skewed a bit towards him, but that's going to mainly be the general consensus is going to be it's based off of messaging for the most part. Arkansas 27.4. We have just an incumbent running for re-election, won by 33.1 against an independent in 2020. That's essentially the libertarian, essentially basically the entire libertarian vote, other than plus in Texas for the most part, was probably roughly the exact same amount of votes, interestingly enough, just based on how much larger Texas is than Arkansas. But that's going to be a safe red seat by all accounts. Colorado 12.8. We have he has said is his final term in the Senate for Hickenlooper. He won by 9.3 against incumbent Gardner, flipping that seat blue in 2020. He managed to flip it red by 2 points in 2014 against Udall. The other Udall, being in New Mexico, managed to hold on though in New Mexico. This was before Colorado got very, very blue. But in 2016, Michael Bennet, who is actually now running for governor, won by 5.7 on the same ballot that Hillary Clinton, I believe, won it by about 3 to 4 points. But anyway, Hickenlooper won it by 9.3%. He is likely to break the double-digit margin this time around. It depends on the strength of his candidate. That's going to be why it's a bit red. Bit redder than expected here, but the war rating minus 0.8 to show a bit of strength for Hickenlooper, even though he was fighting against an incumbent. Delaware minus 22.8 for the expected margin. Very strong overperformer here in, I believe it's Chris Coons, 21.5 points in 2020. The Democrats are probably to do a little bit better, so that's going to probably help things a little bit there for the Democratic race. He's a very strong performer there, especially compared to how a generic Democrat would likely fare. Next up, we have in Georgia, that's going to be John Ossoff, 1.9%. That might not be enough to actually escape a runoff election, which he almost certainly would win, though. But he could potentially breach 50%. That's not necessarily very likely, but he is almost certain to win a runoff scenario. 1.9%. He could win by as much as 5.8. But he's a very strong overperformer. Even while de-seating an incumbent, he actually overperformed by 3.7 points, and the war ratings minus 6.1, which that expected result would be 12.5 in his favor. I doubt it's going to be that high. This is going to be a competitive race, and since Republicans are going to be contesting it, that's really going to be the interesting thing here. We do have polls here. He's winning by 1 against Collins, 5 against Dooley, and 4 against Carter, but we do have a few undecideds. Generally, that might go a bit for the Republican in the state of Georgia, so it's going to be pretty close no matter what, but he could, he could probably end up pulling that off no matter who he ends up running against. Idaho, 32.1%, non-competitive in essentially every sense of the word. One of the reddest states in the entire country. Rich won by just under 30 in 2020, but that was with 2 independents that likely pulled more off from his vote than the Democrat, so this is going to be a very safe margin for the Republicans. 13.4 in Illinois. Dick Durbin is retiring from the Senate here. All of the central Midwestern candidates are retiring this cycle, so that's very interesting to see here. Quite a few retirements just across the board as well. That's 4 to 4 actually, and so that is very interesting to see there. But what we're looking at is in Dick Durbin's seat, Kamala Harris narrowly won the state by more than 10 points. But Dick Durbin won by 16.1 in 2020. While there's not an incumbent here to help boost that, there's not really any strong candidates in the Republican primary. The best that they could potentially get would have been, forget exactly his name, but he did manage to win the Senate seat right after in 2010. Not Charlie Kirk, but Kirk managed to flip this seat in 2010, right after Obama's big win in the huge red wave of 2010. So that was a large red wave. Colorado, interestingly, managed to hold on with Michael Bennet, which just shows how strong of a candidate he was. Meanwhile, even Illinois flipped, which, of course, at that point was an insanely red state. Dick Durbin had won 2 years prior by 39. So obviously that is, but then of course it did flip in 2016. That's Tammy Duckworth's seat now. So, but that's the closest they could get to competitive. Even then, it probably would have been a sleeper flip at best for the Republicans. But as of right now, it is definitely not going to be competitive by any means. Iowa 7.3. This actually is an increase for the Republicans because Joni Ernst generally was a very unpopular candidate. We don't have any polling yet because there's not really any official presumptive nominees at this point. There is, of course, in the Republican primary now you have Ashley Hinson, who's most likely to win here that nomination. So that is going to be the main thing to watch there, Ashley Hinson. But here we do have Josh Turek and Zach Walls are relatively going to be pretty strong candidates. JD Schulten did withdraw from the race, so that's going to be one less candidate there. In the polling, we basically have nothing. Ernst was actually beating all of them, but not by much. But now that Ernst is out of the race, we'll have to see how things go before we're able to make any more official predictions. That's going to be narrowly likely red on the map. Kansas 9.9, just barely under that 10-point margin. In 2020, Marshall only won by 11.4. He is a underperformer. Luckily, in being in Kansas, obviously he's not going to lose by any means, but the expected result here would be 8.7 points from the compared to the PVI performance, and all the way down to 2.3 expected result based on the WAR rating. He is a strong underperformer here, so that's going to be, actually, I don't know, that doesn't seem right, but it's probably not 2 times, it's probably just 1, so that would definitely make things a bit different for all of these races. So yeah, that seems a bit better. But even then, 8.2 is not a very strong number to be looking at. So still, he's a very weak performer. But even then, he's probably not going to end up winning. Race to the White House has him winning by 10.8. Honestly, I don't even think it's actually going to be that high just because of how low of a performer he is. And that's narrowly less than he did in 2020. Kentucky 28.4. They actually, good news for the Republicans to get rid of Mitch McConnell. He was a chronic underperformer in 2014. He only won by 15 and a half. Meanwhile, you had, that was, of course, the same year that Colorado flipped. You had flips in Montana, South Dakota, Iowa, Alaska. These were flips from 2008. That was a large blue wave year. They managed to win huge in a lot of states. And so this was the last time that Democrats had senators in quite a few of these states. So that is definitely going to be a big sign, obviously, that he's a rough underperformer there. I mean, Paul didn't do very well either, even in 2010. But he's a very poor performer. In 2008, he only won by 6. That was actually a relatively close to a flip potential there in 2008, but that didn't actually end up going through. But now that's going to probably go back up towards closer to 28. Louisiana 27, they got rid of the jungle primary system for the general election there, so there will not be a lot of candidates. So honestly, it'll be a bit more consolidated support for one Democrat, which means that likely he will end up winning by a lot less, a lot closer to the PVI, which the expected result would be around 20 points. Maine, this actually is a very narrow flip against Susan Collins. We have the expected large support for the new candidate, the not necessarily presumptive nominee. She's a strong overperformer, but what we're seeing is a lot of there's no polls here yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if on the general Senate page there are a few. It's toss up on race to the White House at this point. Mills by 6 for some reason. Mills is probably not going to be running. So if you end up running with based off the fact you end up having lean R and tilt R for inside elections. So I'm actually going to be going against that prediction here. We have the candidate Graham Plattner has joined. It's more of a populist that generally seems to be a very strong candidate choice, a type of candidate choice, not only in Maine but across the country. Even though Susan Collins did win by 8.5 in 2020, she also has had growing controversy and disdain across the state from what we've been seeing from previous cycles. Massachusetts, that is going to be a strong win for the Democrats. No surprise there. Markey winning by 33, and that's probably going to go up to 35. Michigan, 1.7%. This is going to be another very competitive race, one that's going to be watched all cycle long. Gary Peters is retiring, so now we have Republicans are going to be running Mike Rogers, the exact same candidate. That definitely gave Alyssa Slotkin a run for her money. She only won by a third of a point in 2024. She was a very strong candidate. So that's definitely going to be a potential concern for the Democrats. But in the end, they do end up having some relatively strong candidates. They have Mallory McMorrow, they have Haley Stevens, and they have Abdul El Sayed. So those are going to be the main candidates to be watching. Haley Stevens was beating Rogers, but Rogers was beating El Sayed as well as McMorrow in the more recent polls. So as of right now, it appears that Haley Stevens is going to be the best candidate, but there are a lot of undecideds that will definitely end up making or breaking the race, considering how close the margins are, as well as the margin of error. Obviously, they're all within the margin of error. Minnesota, 5.8 points. This one has slowly been breaking away from the Republicans as things have been changing. They have Penny Flanagan and Angie Craig still. Penny Flanagan's probably the better of the two candidates here, as she obviously is the lieutenant governor of Minnesota. She's won multiple races. Angie Craig isn't a weak candidate by any means, though. Second congressional district. But the problem is that in the Republican primary, they don't really have any very strong candidates, and Royce White is the main leading candidate who was the nominee in 2024, but then did give Amy Klobuchar her closest margin, which for Amy Klobuchar is, anything below 20 points. In 2018, she won by 24. In 2012, she won by 35. In 2006, she won by 20. So that definitely is, a pretty large victory by every mean there. So that's going to be the main concern, I guess you could say. But Amy Klobuchar, 15 points. So that's going to be the main thing to watch there. Royce White, not necessarily a strong candidate. He seems somewhat controversial. It's just a very red year. Next, we move on to Mississippi, 9.6 points. This is going to be another race under 10 points, but not by much. If you look at 2020, Hyde Smith won by 9.98%. It was already under 10 to begin with. She's another chronic underperformer, kind of like Marshall. Based on the underperformance, the expected result would actually be 7. And by the war rating, it would actually be 12. So either way, it's going to be relatively close to that 10 margin there. Depends on who ends up running here, but there's no strong Democrats that are running yet. The best one they could probably get would be the nominee for Senate in 2024. Didn't necessarily do that well against Roger Wicker. Only got 37% of the vote. The best candidate they could probably get would honestly be Thompson for the 2nd district there. That would, because he already has name recognition where he'd need to get every single vote possible from. So it's not going to be necessarily a close race, but just a generic Democrat could potentially do relatively well against her. Montana, 14.9. The reason it was so close, won by 10.02, was because Steve Bullock was a popular incumbent governor in the state of Montana. He last won re-election against current governor Greg Gianforte in 2016. He was term limited, and then in 2020, Gianforte easily won election to his first term, and in 2024, he got re-elected by 20 points. So that's why it was so close in 2020. Even then, it was 10 points. There's not really going to be much of a contest here this time around, and especially with John Tester declining to run. So they're not going to have, the Democrats are not going to have an Ohio moment here where they're going to have a potential strong candidate. Instead, they just have a former state representative running, not necessarily going to do that well against an incumbent here. Nebraska 3.7. This is going to be a relatively close race because of Dan Osborne running again. You have barely incumbent Pete Ricketts, who he was a relatively popular governor. Back in he won a second term by only by 18, but it was in 2018. The same year Kristi Noem only won by 3.5 points. He won his first term in 2014 in a red wave by only 18, though. So that's, he wasn't a huge performer as far as margins go. But then he did end up winning for Senate. He doesn't appear to be an extremely strong candidate, but Osborne absolutely is. He only lost by 6.7 points in a red wave year. So that is potentially going to be able to take out the incumbent here, but as of right now, it doesn't appear so. 4.9 points in New Hampshire, just barely under a likely margin that based on White House 9.6. But based on the current polling in New Hampshire, we actually have plus 11 and plus 18 against Innis. But against Brown, who's generally the presumptive nominee as of right now, Jean Shaheen is retiring. This is huge, sad news for the Democrats. She was a huge overperformer. But Chris Pappas is a very strong performer in his own right. Scott Brown was the former U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. He managed to win that seat also in 2010 in Massachusetts. It was then flipped in 2012 by Elizabeth Warren by 7.5 points. So what you end up with is going to be a relatively contested race, but it could be seen as a carpetbagger or other potential. Depends entirely on how they end up wording it. So potentially the general, again, the messaging is going to be a large part of the campaign there. But again, Jean Shaheen not being in, but then also the Republicans had their own sad news when Chris Sununu, of course, the former governor, very popular former governor, decided to not run. So that would have made him actually favored over Pappas, but instead now he is likely to take that race, potentially probably bring it to likely over the next few days. New Jersey 19.4. This is an incumbency here. That's going to be for the incumbent is Cory Booker. He won by 16.5 in 2020. New Mexico 8.3%. That's going to be a relatively strong margin there for the incumbent. That's going to be then Ray Lujan for a second full term. And so that's going to be the main thing for that. So he's the only one in the Democratic primary. Nella Dominici actually has declined to run, so there's really no candidates here. She's the daughter of the former U.S. Senator, the last Republican to be a Republican senator from New Mexico. And I believe he got beat in 2008. And that is why, he retired for Udall to then take the seat. He last won by 30 points in 2002. And so that's the main thing there. She was the nominee for Senate in 2024, and she did lose by 10.1% to Martin Heinrich. So that's the context there. 8.3 points, no real contest. North Carolina is actually 1.1. This has been narrowing as the general sense of I guess magic around Cooper has slowly been dropping. Race to the White House has at 8.1, but I think that's almost impossible to have that happen there. So that's really going to be something interesting. Tom Tillis is retiring. A lot has happened in this seat. The Democrats basically and everything they could have wanted to have happen did happen. Tom Tillis is not seeking re-election, and this very seat was actually the one that flipped for Kay Hagan in 2008 against Elizabeth Dole. And then in 2014, that red wave year, Tom Tillis beat Kay Hagan by 1.5 points, won re-election by only 1.7 in 2020. He actually was relatively close to losing. So in the Democratic primary, Roy Cooper, the former governor of North Carolina, very popular, did end up running. So that is going to be the main thing here to watch. Roy Cooper against most likely Michael Whatley, the former chair of the Republican National Committee. He only withdrew from being the chair of the RNC to run here. So that's going to be the main thing to watch. But if you look at, there actually is a bit of polling here. It was relatively close. Cooper's up by 8, but he also has the higher name recognition, and also there's a lot of undecided. So it's 3 on this side and 11 on this side. That's 14% undecided. That could easily end up making Whatley win the race. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch as the campaigns get underway, and Whatley's going to try to get his name out there more. But as of right now, Cooper is still in the lead narrowly. Oklahoma, 29.8. This is a relative, obviously a strong margin. Inhofe won by 30 in 2020. Not much to say there. The Democrats don't have much strong candidates. Oregon, 20-point margin here. This is going to be a relatively large margin, especially being on the same ballot as their relatively poor performers for governor. But Jeff Merkley, 17.5 points in 2020. No real expected opposition by the Republicans. There's not really any candidates there. So that is essentially all that's going to happen there. Rhode Island, 36 points, a very strong overperformer in Jack Reed. He wins by huge amounts. Even on the same ballot as Joe Biden, he overperformed by 7. And in general, on that ballot, he overperformed by 20.6%. So, and the war rating is minus 10.9. So somewhere between 36 and 26 is the expected margin. Somewhere around 36, the higher bound there is going to be. Now low bound is the lower number for margin, so that means more towards Democrats. High bound is the higher number, which means more towards Republicans. That's the main explanation there. South Carolina, 13.8. This is the seat of Lindsey Graham. He won against the greatest fundraiser, I believe, in Senate history, Jamie Harrison, and even though he was the greatest fundraiser, he still ended up winning by 10.1%. So that's going to be the main thing. They're not going to be close to as much of a competed race. You do have a few candidates. It depends entirely on who ends up running. If Joe Walsh ends up running, they could potentially end up making things a bit tighter. It depends on how well he does messaging-wise and such. Republicans, you have Lindsey Graham. He does have a primary challenger from the main author of Project 2025, but that may not end up doing that well in a close-ish state as South Carolina. Then you go to South Dakota, 31.1% for the Republicans, rounds 31.5 points. He is retiring. No, he's not. That's the at-large House rep. They're running for governor. Mike Rounds has not officially declared whether or not he's going to run yet, but we don't really have anyone for the Democrats, and even if we did, it's South Dakota. The last time that it had a Democratic senator was going into 2015, and that was after they won re-election in 2008. He went from Johnson. Interestingly enough, he went from Johnson to Rounds, and that he is going to most likely win re-election by a relatively large margin. 25 points in Tennessee. This is going to be most likely both. This is going to be another win for Haggerty, most likely. He's not announced any retirements there. But we literally don't even have a section for the Democratic primary. They may actually, interestingly enough, end up having an uncontested primary or uncontested race. So that would be interesting to see. That rarely ever really happens in the Senate, though. And then in Texas, 3.8% margin here. This is mostly due to just the indecisiveness of the primaries. And so Cornyn is facing a primary challenge from Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. He is not necessarily a poor candidate by any means. He is relatively controversial, though, and there are a few other candidates here that are up in, but it's basically just going to be Ken Paxton versus John Cornyn for the most part. And so that's going to be the main thing to watch there. But Democrats, you have Colin Allred, who actually did relatively well against Ted Cruz in 2024, outperformed Kamala Harris by 5 points. Actually, is in this race, depending on how well things go. That could get somewhat close. James Tallarico could end up running. His announcement is expected in the next 3 days. Beto O'Rourke could end up running, who actually had the closest margin in the state of Texas for Senate in decades, and actually was the beginning of the era since 1988, since Lloyd Benson was in the Senate, and then that seat actually flipped to on an off-cycle election after he passed away, if I remember correctly. So that's going to be the main thing there. He actually started a new era of relatively close elections in Ted Cruz won first election in 2012 by 16, and then by the next time he actually won a re-election to his second term by 2.5 points. And since then, no Senate election in Texas has been by more than 10 points. So it entirely depends on if he ends up running or not. That could end up getting relatively close. We'll have to see who ends up running. In Virginia, we have oops, that's the wrong color. We end up having the incumbent Mark Warner. He's a strong overperformer. He actually overperformed by 2 points compared to Joe Biden with his historic 10-point win in the state of Virginia. Kim Farrington, Republican. That's basically it. All four actually have it as safe Democrat, which is something that you actually generally don't see in the state of Virginia very much. But there it is, 12 points. But even when it's expected to be relatively close in 2024, Tim Kaine won against Hung Kao by 9 points in the final margin there, even on the same ballot that Kamala Harris only won the state by about 4. And wrapping things up here, West Virginia and Wyoming are both about 42 points. These are the reddest states in the entire country, Wyoming, then West Virginia. And so these are both incumbents that are expected to win by large margins, and there's not really much else to say about that. Hopping to Florida first, real quick, 6.1%. This is just because mostly because of the unelected incumbency status here of Ashley Moody here, but generally, there's no real strong candidates here. Unfortunately, Josh Whale did have to withdraw. That was probably would have been the strongest candidate they had. He did relatively well in the 6th congressional district in the special election there. Now, they don't really have many candidates here that are really going to have anything strong. The Democratic Party in Florida has basically collapsed since 2016, and Ashley Moody isn't a not impressive candidate by any means. She ran alongside current governor Ron DeSantis, along with his 20-point win in 2022, which was generally unexpected by a lot of predictors. So that is going to be a relatively strong race. It could end up getting even better for the Republicans as time goes on, or it could be relatively competitive. We'll have to see how well the Democrats end up doing nationwide first. And then finally, and that does mean that they will hold on to control of the Senate. And then finally, in Ohio, we have a narrow flip there not a flip, a narrow hold, 1.9% for the Republicans. This is another off-cycle election. This is looking currently like we have the interim appointment of John Husted, the former not attorney general, lieutenant governor, the former lieutenant governor of Ohio versus former Senator Sherrod Brown. And so, but if Tim Ryan hops into the race here in the primaries versus Sherrod Brown, then immediately this race will go to lean, because that means that Husted will easily have time to be able to end up working on messaging. Meanwhile, Brown will not have to spend a single penny in the primaries, as he will easily be able to carry to the main cycle. He narrowly lost to Bernie Moreno in 2024 by 3.5 points. He's still expected to lose, though, as Moreno was a relatively weak candidate, but he did overperform Kamala Harris by almost 10 points on that same ticket. So that is going to be something interesting to watch there. The main races to watch this cycle are going to be Ohio, That's also going to include North Carolina, Georgia, Maine, and Nebraska. And depending on how things go, potentially Texas. And so for the final prediction here, we have, as of right now, for a forecast, 51 to 49 in the Senate. Two flips for Democrats, which is relatively on par, actually relatively low amount. In 2024, there were four. In 2020, there were five. In 2022, there was only one. There were six in 2018. There were two in 2016. So generally, there's quite a few. This would be a bit on the lower end of total flips in the Senate. And as of right now, we will have to see how things go. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. Make sure to let me know of anything that you have, your opinions. Let me know in the comments. Any ideas for future videos as well. I'm always looking for those. Make sure to like if you enjoyed the video. Tell me what you thought about it, and subscribe and follow on all the platforms to stay up to date. Thank you, and have a fantastic rest of your day.